Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I am excited to go through this material with you, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. So, first to start off, for those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Taslim Alani-Verjee, and I am a clinical psychologist and the director of Salem Center for Mental Health. And today we're going to be talking about coping with uncertainty. So, why do we need to talk about coping with uncertainty? The reason is because right now is a really hard time for a lot of us. There's a lot of new stuff going on. And the question on everyone's mind seems to be, when will we be able to go back to normal? Right? And maybe our normal was pretty chaotic to begin with, but it's quite likely that regardless of the chaos of our lives, this is a new kind of chaos. And we want things to go back to some sort of normality. We want things to go back to some level of predictability. And we just don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know what that's going to look like. And so there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of unknown. We as humans often struggle with what we can't control, and this is part of human nature. The reason why we like to control things is because it makes us feel safe and it makes us feel in control. So it's actually beneficial to us to some extent to be able to want to control things. And being able to control things allows us to maintain a level of safety. This is why we plan things. Maybe some of us plan a little bit more than others, but we like to plan as humans. We also make gut assumptions. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're biased, but we make them, and we make them because to some extent they're supposed to help us survive in this world. They're supposed to help keep us safe. Now, none of us actually know what's ever going to happen in any given moment. I don't know what's going to happen right now, but I can probably make some safe predictions about it. And even though I don't know for sure, I'm pretty comfortable with the level of risk because I know my environment. And so while we usually are dealing with uncertainty all the time, most of us are dealing with the level of uncertainty that we're pretty comfortable with. And we're pretty comfortable with it because we know enough about our settings, we know enough about our routine that we can predict our environment. We can usually predict the people we're around. We might notice that in new environments or around new people, we may feel a little bit more on guard or anxious. And that's because we can't usually predict these things. And so we all do live with a certain level of uncertainty, and yet we most of the time manage this pretty effectively. Some of us like more control, whereas others are pretty good at going with the flow, and that really doesn't matter, right? I mean, if your level of control brings you anxiety, then this is where it can get hard. But we also maybe just kind of come in and out of needing that sense of control, and that's okay. The people who are better at going with the flow are probably having an easier time managing right now. But either way, it's probably pretty hard regardless. And especially right now, when we think about it, things are probably throwing us completely off balance. And so, no matter how good we are at going with the flow with things, right now, there's so much new, there's so much change, there's so much that's unpredictable that most of us are probably having a pretty hard time. So, usually, when we feel like we can't control things, we may turn to unhelpful strategies. So, this can include making lots and lots of plans and schedules, thinking and rethinking again about how we can control things. Um, we may engage in a lot of what if thinking. So, for example, what if I plan this thing for 5 weeks from now? Then do you think it will work? Do you think people will come? Do you think I'll be able to do it? Or what if I then plan it for 5 weeks from now and then have to reschedule it? Then when should I reschedule it for? And do you think it's going to be okay then? And what if nothing ever works out? Right. And so we can kind of go into a what if spiral, and that can happen pretty quickly. And it can get out of control. We might also engage in excessive worrying about the future. And when we engage in excessive worrying, this can make it hard to sleep, can make it hard to relax, can make it hard to calm down, can make it hard to focus. It can also make it hard to just feel well, both emotionally and physically. And so that excessive worrying becomes pretty unhelpful, and sometimes we can get stuck in it. Now, we all have moments of worrying, and that's totally normal. And some of us worry a little bit more, also totally normal. But when we're stuck in our worrying, it probably leads to a lot of difficulty. Like we might not be able to get things done. We might have stomach aches. We might get headaches. Um, all sorts of things can happen that decrease the quality of our lives and affects our well-being. Right now is a very normal time to struggle with uncertainty because there is so much uncertainty. But that doesn't mean that we need to deal with that uncertainty in an ineffective way. And so, what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to walk us through 6 ways that we can try to be more effective in dealing with the uncertainty. It obviously doesn't make the stress go away, it won't eliminate the worry. You're allowed to worry about this. You're allowed to not know and to be uncomfortable with the not knowing. So, it's not about getting rid of the anxiety or the worry, but rather helping us all manage day to day because this is hard. And for some of us, it's kind of taking over our lives. So if we can find strategies that will help, let's use them. So the first one is mindfulness. That's being focused on the present. Now, you've probably heard me talk about mindfulness a bunch of times. You've probably heard other people talk about mindfulness a bunch of times. And so the reason why mindfulness is helpful is because we can't be totally focused and engaged on one single thing and be worried about something else at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. And so, if we can allow ourselves to be totally present and in the moment without being judgmental, without trying to predict the future, just here, right now, totally present, totally engaged, then we're worrying less. And that can be pretty helpful. Mindfulness can actually help us rewire our brain so that we end up naturally worrying less and we end up being able to focus more. And so it's not just about the here and now focusing, but when we practice that, it actually makes us worry less altogether. And so the practice of mindfulness can be extremely helpful. Now, some ways that you can try to apply mindfulness in your life are through structured strategies such as following, a mindfulness workbook or using some apps for guided meditations and mindfulness exercises. But you can also take the things you're doing in your regular day-to-day and try to do them mindfully, right? So do one thing at a time as opposed to doing maybe 3 or 4 things at a time. You can even watch TV mindfully, and that means not texting while you're watching TV, not eating while you're watching TV, just being totally aware of how your body feels while sitting, what you're watching, all the colors, all the sounds. Also, perhaps noticing any thoughts or emotions that may be coming into your mind while you're watching TV. And so it's not necessarily about changing your routine, but rather engaging in your routine more effectively. So that's mindfulness. Strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is to set aside worrying time. So if you're finding that the worrying is taking over your entire day, it's kind of coming in and out, or it might just be there all of the time, try setting aside specific time for worrying. Now, I remember when I first heard this strategy, I thought it was pretty silly because I can't control my worrying. I'm going to worry, so I'm going to worry. However, when we set aside structured time to worry, we give ourselves permission to worry as much as we want to have all of the nervous worry thoughts that we're experiencing, to have all of the fear and the what ifs and the shoulds, all of that. We can do it without stopping ourselves until it's time to stop. And so, for example, we can perhaps set 20 minutes of worrying during the day and 20 minutes of worrying somewhere in the evening, usually not too close to bedtime because then it might seep in when we get to bed. But having that dedicated time acknowledges that there are things to be worried about and that we can't necessarily not think about those things, but maybe we can try to contain the way we think about them, try to focus a little bit more on worrying when we're worrying. And that allows us to almost worry in a mindful way. And so by setting aside time for worrying, we can free up the rest of the day. And when we notice those worry thoughts creeping in, we can pause and give ourselves permission to worry about it later, right? We can say, oh, I'm worrying about it right now, but my worry time is in 3 hours. So let me make a note to worry about this later. Again, this might seem silly, but it can actually be extremely helpful for catching yourself in the worry thoughts and giving yourself permission to not worry about it right now. We worry because we're scared. We worry because we try to protect ourselves. And so you're not saying that you're not going to think about these things at all. You're just going to spend dedicated time thinking about it as opposed to worrying about it while you're maybe half distracted watching TV or half distracted cooking or half distracted writing something, working on school, anything. So it's actually being more productive in our worrying. Strategy 3, take control over what you can. In a time in which we feel like there's almost no control over our futures, our well beings to some extent, it can feel like we have control over nothing. But that's not true. We actually have control over quite a bit, but in our anxiety, we might forget what we can control. And so regain some of that. Some of the ways that we can regain control are by sticking to a routine, right? Most of us have at least some control over what time we're going to wake up, what we're going to eat for breakfast, what time we're going to shut things down for the evening. Now, of course, there might be unpredictability with that too, especially for those who live with other people or who have children. But we do have some sense of control over those things. Stick to what you can control. The other strategy that I find particularly helpful is to make a list of all of the things that we're worried about, all of the things we think we need to be working on, figuring out, planning for. Make a list of everything. And then color code it. What are the things that you can work on right now? What are the things you don't have any control over? That helps you figure out what things, if you have no control over them, can you just let go of, versus the things that you actually can control right now. Right? So we can't necessarily control whether we're going to get sick, and we might be spending a lot of time worrying about that or worrying if others are going to get sick. But what we can control are our preventative measures, right? So that's the things like staying at home, like washing our hands. And while we can perhaps talk about this with respect to COVID-19, it applies all the time, right? We might be worried about an exam or an upcoming licensing thing that we have to do. It might be a confrontation that's coming up or a job interview. Regardless of what it is, there are some things we can control and there are some things we can't. And so if we let go of the things we can't control and spend our time focusing on the things we can control, we're actually increasing our options of being more effective because we're investing our time in the things that are worth investing in and not investing our times and our time in the things that we can't actually control. And so there's no sense trying to plan, trying to think through, trying to what if, because it's not a good use of our time. And so again, this helps us minimize the anxiety, but it also helps us be more effective. Strategy number 4, ride the emotions. This is about knowing how you're feeling, being able to recognize it, and trying not to make it go away. Now, for a lot of us, when we experience unpleasant or negative emotions, what we might try to do is to make them go away. So we might try to numb them by perhaps watching something funny or engaging. We might try to do it by eating ice cream because ice cream is pretty good at making us feel good. So food, numbing through music or TV. It might be using substances to make us not feel what we're feeling. Regardless of what it is, these are all strategies to make the emotions not affect us anymore. But what we're doing when we try to numb or distract ourselves is we're actually not honoring where we're at. And the reality of the situation is we feel how we feel, and our emotions are communicating things to us. They're communicating how we're feeling, how we're interpreting a situation, what we need to do about the situation. And so when we numb, actually ignoring all of that information. And it's not like the situation gets better after we numb or distract ourselves. The situation's still going to be there. And maybe we've made it worse by doing that. So instead, what we can try to do is to ride them out. And so first step, try to identify the emotion. Try to identify the thoughts that come with the emotion, the physical sensations that come with the emotion, and then just try to experience them. Just sit, feel it, allow it to be there. It doesn't need to take over. It doesn't need to control. It can just be. You don't need to wish it away. Then try to remind yourself that this is temporary, right? You're not going to feel this way forever just because you felt this way right now. And if you're having trouble knowing that this isn't a forever thing, you might be able to think about more positive experiences that you've had recently, times when you didn't feel this way. You can also think about some of the things that you might be able to change to prevent yourself from feeling this way in the future. All of these things allow us to plan, but they don't negate the emotion. They don't invalidate the emotion. They don't make the emotion go away. Instead, it's about honoring the emotion and using that information so that we can feel well and we can take care of ourselves. Number 4, acceptance. This means accepting the current situation, including the discomfort and the distress that we feel, and accepting that unpredictability can't control us. So yeah, there's a lot of unpredictability right now. There's probably a lot of distress right now, a lot of stuff that we don't like, and yet it can't control us. So if we accept the reality, we accept that there are things that we just don't know, this lets us not be mad at it, right? We're not stuck in the injustice of it. We're not stuck in the worrying. We're not stuck in the future. We're not stuck in the past. We are here right now, and we accept that this is what it is for us in this moment. Acceptance can be extremely helpful because it allows us to remember that we still get to make some decisions in this situation. And if you were able to attend last week's webinar on living by our values, we might remember that we can still be the people we want to be regardless of the situation that we're in, right? And so accepting the distress and accepting the unpredictability means that we know that this is what it is. We're no longer trying to change the situation. We're no longer trying to change the reality. And instead, we can perhaps try to commit to being the people we want to be, to spending our time the way we find it meaningful to spend the time that we want to spend. It doesn't mean that we need to change anything. It just means we accept it. And the last option, or the last strategy, is practicing gratitude. Now, in a situation where it's hard, it might be pretty challenging to find things to be grateful for. That's fair, right? This is a hard time, and there might not be a whole lot to be thankful for. And yet, I trust that each of us can find at least one thing to be grateful for right now, whether it's having access to technology so that you can be watching this webinar, whether it's having a roof over your head or something to eat, whether it's having good company at home if that's what you have at home, or having access to TV, whether it's the fact that even though everything is different, there are still some ways that you can continue on with your goals, or being grateful that the government is doing some things to support us. Regardless of what it is, having gratitude can change our perspective of the situation. The other thing gratitude does is it actually helps us rewire our brain. So much like mindfulness allows our brain to be rewired, gratitude does the same thing. So when we practice gratitude, it actually allows us to focus on the positive. It's not about ignoring the negative, but it's about realizing that there are still things that we can trust to be there for us, that we can be thankful for, that the universe is still to some extent taking care of us. One study actually showed that when people wrote gratitude letters, even if they didn't send them, their overall mood and energy levels were better, and that they just demonstrated more ability to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort in their emotions. So when we practice gratitude, we're actually improving our overall mental health and well-being as well. That's what I have in terms of strategies. I'm going to open it up for some questions if anyone has any. And in the meantime, I will pull up my slide. So I have a question here about what do you do when a strategy might not work right away? Or how do you know which one is right for you? It's a great question. So strategies generally won't work right away. I mean, the ones that work the best are usually not the most effective ones, right? But being able to try and experiment with things. Different things will work at different times. So what I usually suggest to people is experiment with low risk things. So it might be, for example, when you're feeling a little bit sad or a little bit angry, what's going to work for you? When you're feeling, you know, medium sad or medium angry, what's going to work for you? The more we get to know ourselves, the more we get to know which strategies are going to work for us. But if this is new, it's going to take a bit of experimenting. Mindfulness can be hard. Finding gratitude can be hard, especially when we're having a really hard time. And so sometimes the more active things end up being helpful. And so it might be going for a walk or listening to some music that allows you to channel your emotions a little bit more effectively. And so instead of listening to music that's happy to make your sadness go away, it might be more about listening to sad music so that you can connect with your sadness. You don't want to elevate your level of emotion, but you can still sit with it. You still can experience it. And so for all of us, different strategies will work at different times, and different versions of these strategies will also work. So for example, when we think about mindfulness, the practices of mindfulness that might be helpful for one person may or may not be helpful for another person. And that's okay. It's about finding what's going to work for you and honoring that, recognizing that we're each separate individuals, we're each unique. And while these things generally are found to be helpful for most people, how we practice them, how we interpret them, how we use them, that's yours to figure out. I have another question here on how could we bring up mindfulness in a gentle way to someone who might not think it could be useful for them? And that's a great question. You know, when I talk to a lot of people, they say they've tried mindfulness, it doesn't work, or it's extremely uncomfortable. I remember the first time I learned about mindfulness, I really, really didn't like it because I wasn't used to being able to sit with my thoughts and sit with my emotions and not just busy myself. And I like to be busy because to some extent it makes me feel good and productive, but it also helps me not have to focus on how I'm feeling. And that's how a lot of people function in this world. That's why we like so many different stimuli at any given time, because it keeps us distracted. It doesn't necessarily keep us unproductive, but it keeps us disconnected. And so if we want to bring mindfulness up to someone in a gentle way, we can maybe try it out with them. Try out a practice with them that they might be into. So for example, if you know that this person likes to cook, then trying to do a mindfulness exercise with them where they're cooking and they're not doing anything else. The more we can find mindfulness exercises that people are actually going to like, the more they will be inclined to try them out. The other thing that becomes challenging is that people don't necessarily recognize their own internal dialogues, right? And so when you ask someone after 3 minutes of silence if they had any thoughts that came into their minds, a lot of people will say no. And the reality is that for most people, that's not actually true. But when we're not aware of our internal dialogue, then we can't notice what's happening. And so training ourselves to be more aware of our thoughts, to be more aware of our emotions, helps us figure out what we need to do, how to sit with it, how to let go of it. If we don't even know what's happening, we can actually let go of it. I see another question here. How much worrying time is probably too much? You know, I think that this is also probably unique to each individual. You probably don't want to schedule 12 hours a day of worry time because you probably have other things you need to do. But finding, even if it's an hour, and if you dedicate an hour of worrying time twice a day, what you're probably going to find is that after about 20 minutes, probably going to be exhausted with all that worrying. And so you can set aside that dedicated time and experiment with it again. So you might say an hour, you might even say 2 hours at a time. And if you really, really give it all the worrying you've got, that's great. And you might then decide to adjust it accordingly. But it's about being intentional. If you notice your worrying is starting to affect your overall well-being, so in that 20, 30 minutes of worrying, if you're getting so anxious that you're going to maybe have a panic attack or you're getting indigestion or you're getting a headache, that's probably too much worrying time. But the likelihood of that happening is actually quite low if it's intentional worrying time. When that's more likely to happen is when we're worrying in ways that are not intentional. So for example, when we're working on a project and those worries are coming in, that's usually when we're more inclined to have those really anxious reactions because we feel like we have no control. When we're controlling the worrying time, it usually ends up being less distressing, but it gives us permission to do it. The last thing I want to say, and I'll wait for more questions, so feel free to have them come in, is that, again, this is a really hard time for a lot of us. And so practicing self-compassion becomes very important. The mindfulness helps with that. The controlling what we can control helps. The writing the emotions helps. The gratitude helps. The acceptance helps. And the setting aside worrying time also helps because it honors the fact that we are allowed to worry. And so practicing self-compassion means that we recognize we might not be the best versions of ourselves right now. We might not be as productive as we can be right now. You might be seeing lots of things on the internet saying, this is the time to clean out your closets and reorganize, or, this might be the only time in your life where you actually have time. So make it the best and, accomplish your goals. There are also lots of memes out there on how we're all going to gain weight during this time because all we're doing is eating. What I would encourage you to do is let go of all of that because it's all extremely judgmental. Again, this is a time of uncertainty. You don't need to accomplish your life goals just because life has slowed down. You don't need to lose weight. You don't even need to maintain the same weight. Of course, if you can be healthy, if you can accomplish your goals, if you can do everything you've ever wanted to do, go for it. But for most of us, we're pretty stressed right now. We're pretty anxious right now, and we don't know what life is going to bring. And so don't put extra pressure on yourself. Honor where you're at and just do the best you can. And some days that might be doing a whole lot of nothing. And other days it might mean that you can maybe work through that closet. Maybe you can't. It doesn't matter. Having self-compassion means recognizing that this is hard and that we're each doing the best that we can do. If you find that you're not actually doing the best that you can do, that you're spending a lot of time in bed, avoiding the reality of the situation, you're avoiding responsibilities, especially if you're someone who usually can keep up with a certain level of routine and you've lost that routine completely, if you're feeling extremely anxious where it's really hard to focus on anything else, it might be time to reach out for some help. And there are lots of good places that can provide that kind of support for you. And you might have seen some lists floating around the internet of articles, blogs, webinars like this that you can refer to. There are also lots and lots of services across the country that are offering sliding scales and pro bono services. Salem Center for Mental Health is one of those places. We're offering a pretty generous sliding scale right now. We're also offering pro bono services. And so if you need help, if you're having trouble doing your day-to-day, reach out, get some help. You can even get a free consultation just to see if this is going to work for you. And this is also something that you can encourage family and friends to do because a lot of the time when people are in distress, they don't realize that it might be helpful to talk to someone. They might not feel comfortable talking to someone that they know, but they can talk to a professional, someone that they don't know, someone who can hear them, someone who can validate them, and someone who can provide them with some strategies and skills so that they can manage more effectively. And so reach out, get a free consultation, find someone who you connect with, and encourage your family and friends to do the same. So on the screen, you'll be able to see our email address and phone number. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel at Salem Center for Mental Health where you can check out all of our webinars. And we hope that this has been helpful. So thank you all for attending. And we look forward to having you join our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.